Thank you very much, Ken. This is indeed a pleasure and a privilege to be able to do this. We're going to kind of walk through a little bit of the lectureship and how it was set up, as well as the other component of what was set up by the family and many of the friends and clientele that work with the family. And it's really a neat program. So there's two pieces to this program. One is the lectureship, the other is the scholarship. I really want to do the scholarship part first. The scholarship part is set up for Kansas State University students, usually in about their junior year. It's a $3,000 per year scholarship. Been amazed at the quality of students that go through K-State here. Each year we have a chance to interview and review those. And I do want at this time to introduce the two young men that were selected as the 2013 recipients of the Henry Gardner Scholarship. Tyler Schultz, Jared Wynn. If you guys would please stand. Thank you. These guys are outstanding students. They're involved in every activity here on campus. They're both members of the livestock judging team. Very, very successful. Amazing as I look at these students. Both carry a 4-point GPA. I know some of you are thinking you also had a 4-point GPA, but that's not adding the spring and summer together. This is each semester they get a 4-point. A few of the rest of us could get a 4-point, but it took a couple semesters. At least that's how we explained it to our parents, right? Well, anyway, these are excellent students, and we're extremely proud of them, and I know the family is as well, being able to recognize them. The second feature, or the second part of this, is also a fun part. And in the essence of brevity, I will not probably do justice to introducing these. I'll try to do it as quickly as I can, but I do want to make a few statements about each of both the lectureship and the individual it's established for, and his contributions to the beef industry, as well as the initial lecturer. And so the lectureship is set up. This is the inaugural one this year, as Ken introduced. It recognizes the dedication and contributions that Henry Gardner has made to the beef industry. Some of us had the chance to know Henry extremely well. He's the great individual. He was just a privilege to have a chance to spend time with him. Others of you certainly know of him and know of the Gardner Angus operation and the impact they've had on the business. But I want to characterize just a couple, 2 or 3 little things about Henry that truly made him kind of the icon, the industry leader, the visionary that he was in the beef industry. When Henry was in school here at college at K-State in animal science in the 1950s, one of the things that Henry already figured out, because he was watching these dairy guys make progress with a little thing called artificial insemination. Henry thought, well, why couldn't we use that in the beef cattle industry? And so he took an artificial insemination class, learned the technique, took it home to their operation, and started artificially inseminating Angus cattle. This was at a time, think back, now you're over 60 years ago, artificial insemination was not used in the beef industry. And not only did he take it back to the operation, but he then incorporated it as 100% of the breeding program, because if you're going to make genetic progress, you have all the cattle involved. That's absolutely amazing when you consider the environment in southwest Kansas that he had to implement that in, how crude that technology was in those days. It was absolutely amazing that he was able to accomplish that. But he had the vision that what he could do for cattle genetics. The other part that Henry would do, and I remember when I arrived at K-State wondering why a seed stock guy would be doing this, but he would feed cattle. Not only did he feed cattle, he belonged to a feeding club that each year put a pen of cattle on feed. And his thought process was, if you produce genetics, you need to know how those genetics will function throughout the rest of the cattle industry. So he would take those through the feedlot. Not only did he take them through the feedlot, but he'd then find somebody that knew a little bit about meats that could help him collect carcass data. And so in the 60s, he was put his hard hat on, trudging around packing plants and collecting carcass data on all the cattle that went through their feeding program. Now, in those days, again, even still to this day, very little carcass data is really collected by the cattle industry, or not enough, not as much as should be. And he was doing that basically 50 years ago. It was so impactful that at the time the American Angus Association decided to put together their genetic program. They needed a carcass database, and of course, where do you go to get a carcass database? Henry, by that time, already had about 12, 15 years of data, and it became really the initial foundation for what now is the largest carcass database in the beef cattle industry. So that's just a few little smidgens of how Henry would look ahead and be able to see down the road of what was happening and where the beef industry needed to be. Not surprising, Henry was very closely linked to Kansas State University. He was a proud graduate of K-State, a proud graduate of this department, and one of the things that in the era he became very close friends with Dr. Don Good, and Don would always encourage us as staff members to head out to Gardner Angus and see if we could do some projects. And Henry loved doing those projects with faculty members. We would head out there. There were many, many projects conducted out there. We used to always refer to the operation as the branch experiment station of the animal science department, and it literally was. There were a lot of different projects done there. Some were a little harebrained. I know that for a fact because I took a few of them out there. So they were a little loose, but as we'd leave, Henry'd say, yeah, we're going to do that. And I'm sure as we drove off, as the story would go, the family members and the rest of the people, the staff would say, Henry, why are we doing this? And Henry would always say, because we might learn something. And that was kind of his philosophy, his curiosity. He was always looking for ways that this industry could be better, it could do things more effectively, and that's kind of the legacy, that's kind of the dedication that he really had to this industry. And so, as I said, I really can't do it full justice because there's many, many other things leadership-wise that I should acknowledge. But I want to transition into introducing today's speaker. When we established two pieces of maintaining Henry's legacy, the scholarship was one, and the other we thought would be appropriate to bring a lectureship. And we wrestled for quite a while where that lectureship should be. And very logically, because of Henry's dedication to the department and the leadership that he had provided within the department, it seemed logical that it become part of Cattleman's Day. And so in this year, the 100th anniversary of the Animal Science Department, the 150th anniversary of Kansas State University, the lectureship is launched. The individual speaking here today, as Dr. Odie alluded to, is Mr. Steve Hunt. Steve's background is a little like Henry's early background in the sense he was from a cattle operation, Cowley County. Father was in the cattle business, all aspects of it, including, as I remember, Steve fed a few cattle on occasion. Steve graduated from here, I think, in about 1980. Went on back to the family operation, and then after a family accident, he ended up in the lending business, and then gravitated to working with a group of cattlemen who had a vision that Steve shared, and that is you could actually put a program together where you'd buy an interest in a packing company, and you would set up a program, a grid marketing program, that you would actually be rewarded for all the management and decisions that you made. And so to set that up, initially it started as kind of a closed co-op concept, and there needed to be membership. And so we had a series of membership drives throughout Kansas, throughout Nebraska. Ken was telling me all the way up into Mobridge, South Dakota, down into Oklahoma. These guys went all over the country. They used to kid themselves. They weren't even sure what city they were in at a particular time because it was a regular caravan. One of those first meetings I remember well was right here in this room, Weber Hall, where we were talking about, in this specific room, talking about how this program would be put in place. Now, when you talk about a group of cattlemen having to buy shares and owning a packing company, you can imagine how well that was received. I remember sitting next to a guy one time at one of these meetings, and he said, you know, this thing has absolutely the same chance of succeeding as K-State has of winning a Big 12 football championship. Now, I thought that's an interesting analogy. Now, actually, it was 1996, and Bill Schneider was already winning, so he sat there for a while. He said, I didn't say that very well. I think we have a better chance of winning a Big 12 football championship. And so it forever won. They'd had the vision that these folks did. There were about 10 naysayers that said, this thing absolutely is the silliest idea I've ever heard. It has no chance of succeeding. But one of those that knew it would succeed, he knew it would succeed, was Steve Hunt. And he took this along with a group of cattlemen. They took this message out. And as is typical of the state of Kansas, there are also a lot of individuals in the cattle industry that had an amazing vision. I'm always amazed, having lived in this state for many years, that this is a unique state. And they shared that vision in terms of the potential it could be and how it could be developed. And thus, late in, I think, 1996, the formation of U.S. Premium Beef occurred under the leadership of Steve Hunt. Now, I remember very well the year after it was put in place. And we were sharing some of those thoughts this morning with Steve. It was an ugly year in the cattle feeding business. Cattle feeders were losing money. Imagine that, a phenomena. Cattle feeders actually losing money on occasion. But in that year, it was a tough year, an extremely tough year, weather-wise, price-wise, and it took a lot of leadership. It took a lot of character. It took a lot of dedication. It took somebody with a vision to keep that going. Sound a little like this scholarship, this lectureship is named after? Well, this individual that kept it going was Mr. Steve Hunt. So you're going to be privileged here to a very unique individual. His accomplishments, the success of that program, it is clearly recognized as one of the most successful programs of this kind in the United States, in the beef industry, not only recognized in the United States, but basically worldwide. Steve, great to have you as a part of the first lectureship. You're a very appropriate individual to do that. Let's give him a big K-State welcome, Mr. Steve Hunt.
Thank you, Larry. I really appreciate those words, and I want to tell you, this is a tremendous honor. I want to thank Greg and Mark for thinking of me for this. We're going to talk about this a little bit later, but it might seem that this could turn into a pretty big commercial. I think Larry's got kicked off in pretty good shape. But it was about 17 years ago today, maybe 16 and a half years ago, that I think it was the last time I was speaking here in McKee Auditorium. And we were on what Larry was referring to and Mark always referred to as the Blue Sky Tour. And that was a very fitting description because we were talking about a lot of things that for many of us weren't sure made a lot of sense. The one thing that was pretty obvious to us, however, was that we had some challenges in our industry. That was a simple thing. Coming up with solutions to these challenges was a little more difficult. And then implementing those solutions, as Larry has alluded to, were far more difficult. What I'd like to do today, and to try to avoid a shameless commercial here, is talk about the fact that what's happened in the last 17 years in our industry is truly phenomenal. It is probably the greatest turnaround story that we have ever had in the beef industry. And it wasn't just because of U.S. premium beef and just because of those of us working with it. It was because of all of you and the people of our industry that we had the greatest turnaround in our history, much like our football team, Larry. I'm going to take just a few minutes to talk about what we were visiting about back in 1995. But I want to spend most of my time today talking about what it took for us to take our information, take incentives, and improve the product that we were producing. Many of you will recall back in 1995, what we spent a lot of time talking about was the fact that what exasperated the challenges for us in the beef industry was a very, very efficient pork and poultry industry. That was really efficient predominantly because of the integrated strategies that they have. Good or bad, when a branded food company owns poultry production and pork production, you realize tremendous efficiencies, not only in the production side, but also in the information transfer. When you have a direct linkage between the consumer all the way through to the production, that is a huge advantage. And that really exasperated some of the challenges that we were facing in our industry at that time. I don't know that this description was very well liked back in 1995, and it may not be liked very well today, but the reality was our marketing system was broke. Our marketing system, primarily in the Midwest and further south, our fed cattle were traded predominantly on a live animal basis. We still do that today. But back then in 95, there were very few cattle that were really finished and marketed on a value-based system. There was very little incentive for producers to increase the quality of their product. Additionally, there was very little information that was transferred back from the consumer to the producer. And it kind of made sense as we visited with processors as to why aren't we sending information back to producers, and their answer was, well, they're not taking accountability for these cattle. We're the ones taking the responsibility. That information is ours. And that led to really our next challenge, and that was really generational mistrust that built within our industry between the segments. And so what was the result of this? What we spelled out here and what we realized was, and this is a tribute to the beef industry, is we went out and did a beef quality audit. 1995 was our first beef quality audit. And what were the results? I think all of us remember sitting down and reading these results with a level of frustration. Many quality challenges, challenges in palatability, challenges in our consistency and cutability. It was an abysmal report telling us something that, frankly, we probably already knew. Well, what was even more concerning was, in 1995, only 4 years later, we conducted another audit. And what did that audit say? The industry has done very little to address the challenges identified in the 1991 audit. Well, frankly, for many of us, that was the last straw. In many ways, there was a revolt that was beginning within the industry, and Larry alluded to this. A lot of the things that we were talking about were not embraced by a lot. What we realized was, in our research, was that a lot of cattle were not getting enough. On the other hand, there were a lot of cattle that were getting paid too much, and that wasn't very popular. And our industry was doing what they should do. They were doing what the system told them to do. That's producing pounds of live animal efficiently. And the University of Kansas State and others advised them and promoted it, and producers followed it and were the best in the world. The problem was the system didn't reward for quality. The system provided no incentive or reward for producing cattle that met the demands of the consumer. You know, Winston Churchill, I think, had it right. No revolution was ever fought and won under the battle cry, "We must reach consensus." We had a lot of disagreement within the industry, but we weren't out to reach consensus. We were out to begin solving the challenges that we all were facing. This was about the time, I'd say, Mark, probably early 1996, that Mark Gardner and I met in Medicine Lodge, Kansas at a Pizza Hut. We were one of many that read the 95 results and were very concerned. We spent an evening talking about what we're leaving for our next generation. Yes, and we made comparisons to the sheep industry and the direction we were going. Frankly, we were concerned about, is this an industry we're staying in if we continue down this path? At that point in time, we knew there was a lot of efforts throughout the industry to improve the system, to improve the marketing. And we made a decision then to join a group that was working on that. But again, this isn't just about what U.S. Premium Beef did. This is about an industry coming together. During that time, there were a number of people, a number of groups that came together to support this cause. One, of course, was Henry Gardner and Raymond Adams and Don Good. Don Good sat right over here in this chair the last time I was in this auditorium speaking. And he stood up and looked at the group and said, of all my years, we're at the most critical juncture for our beef industry. And the efforts that we're talking about today are the most dynamic I've ever seen. But we also received support from the financial community, particularly those that were lending to commercial feedlot operations and others who are on the front lines of the challenges that we faced in the marketing of our cattle. Universities, Kansas State University, we held numerous meetings here with Larry, with Dr. Schroeder and others talking about what we can do if we start with a clean slate. What's the ideal plan? What's the ideal project that would address the challenges that we're facing in the industry? Again, while we were proud to play a role, we weren't the only ones involved in this process. Well, I am going to be shameless for a minute. I'm going to talk about something that I know a little bit about, but I'm going to talk about it because I think it's a good example of what many in the industry have done. Not exactly the same thing, but many in our industry came together and worked on ways to develop design supply systems, value-based systems for getting accountability back in the production of beef. So our key elements were pretty simple. One was value-based pricing on every single animal that came into our system. Now that's quite a commitment when you think about it. We're sitting in the heart of a part of the country where very few cattle are fed to a meat point. Very little carcass data had been sent out on the cattle we were producing. We had commercial feed yards that sent letters to every one of their customers and said, we're committed to accountability. We're committed to this program, and every one of your cattle now are going to be marketed over a meat program and graded accordingly and paid accordingly. And if you don't like it, we invite you to find business elsewhere. Now, can you imagine sending that letter out in that environment? But we had a lot of our members that were doing just those things. They were committed to it. No more averages. Every single animal that comes through is going to be paid on a meat basis, on a value-based system. Information transfer. Whatever processing we end up with, we're going to make sure we have trolley track. We're going to make sure we have ways to identify each and every carcass and get that information back on every carcass to the producers within 48 hours at no cost. Well, here's the other one. When I stood here 17 years ago and talked about packer ownership, as Larry alluded to, I got a lot of blank stares. You'd have thought I walked in wearing a KU jersey. And it was not an easy decision. Let me tell you, I got it. Producers going out and owning processing was a giant leap. It was aggressive, it was bold, but we felt it was important for us that we had a way to control the process, that we could have the most efficient way possible to communicate from the consumer through processors to the producer, to correct what was not happening in our industry. Not everybody had to do this as far as other alliances and other things, but for us, if we could pull this off, and believe me, we would not have pursued this unless we had pretty good feeling that it would work. We looked at a lot of different opportunities, and it was not an easy decision, but we were committed to at least try. So we started simple. Raymond Adams would always tell us, boys, keep it simple. When 90% of your members or your producers have never delivered to a meat program before, believe me, we got it. We have to keep it simple. We focus on yield grade, quality grade, hot carcass weight, CAB qualifiers, weight qualifiers, and we kept it simple. We encouraged our producers not to swing for the fence, but to take average cattle and take small steps. Go for singles and go for doubles. And that's how we started. Well, I'm going to take a second on this chart. There's a lot of information here. The vertical axis is dollars per head, beginning back in 1998 and ending last year, 2012. The red line is our average premiums paid, dollars per head, in that particular year. Now, we have to be careful with averages. They're a little dangerous, so we broke that out into the lower 25% and the top 25% of cattle delivered. As Larry once again alluded to, we learned a lot of different ways to use and a lot of definitions of body parts and cavities over that first 6 months. It was a challenge. And in fact, in anticipation of the education we were going to be facing, we attempted to reduce the tuition. And we actually put a floor on the price for the first 6 months, knowing that there were a lot of producers that had never delivered over a meat program and would probably have a lot to learn. And believe me, we all had a lot to learn. But look at the trend line. And look how they stayed with it. 2012, the average premium was over $60 a head. If you were delivering in the top 25%, that premium average is over just under $120 per head. It was impressive. Those early years of approaching it simple evolved into our program being an anchor to our processing companies' value-added business, value-added products. It became a commitment for the cattle we were producing week after week to supply their programs. The range of outcomes when we began back in 1998 was just under $300 a head. However, in 2012, as we developed more programs and fine-tuned, the range of outcomes on cattle delivered was actually over $600 a head. So in 2012, as I said, we became the anchor for our programs. They were committed to us, our processing business, and we were committed to delivering to them. We added private labels of Black Canyon Premium Reserve, natural programs, at least 2 natural programs. We added the age and source verified. We began becoming specialized as far as what we were delivering. Brian Bertelson likes to, he does this a lot better than I do, by the way, and he's sitting up here in the audience. I'm tempted to have him come down. But Brian talks about the fact that instead of the shotgun now, we're really operating with precision of a 30-06 Winchester with a scope. And that's really what our producers are doing. I also asked Brian to prepare for me kind of what he considered the top 5 influencers on beef quality. You know, in the early days, even I was answering phones and talking to producers about their results. And there wasn't a call that went by where somebody was talking about how they were disappointed or how they were impressed. Unfortunately, we heard more from those that were disappointed. And we went through the checklist. And the producer might have said, well, they were all black-hided cattle that lined up well and from a legitimate seed stock producer, but they lost $50 a head on the grid. They didn't grade. Well, the good news is you can probably go back and get carcass EPDs. That's a place to start. Do those cattle have the propensity to grade? Maybe not. We talked about nutrition because that's a lifelong experience for these cattle, whether they're in the womb of their mother or in a feedlot. We talked about feedlot management. We've learned in the weight you place these cattle, how long they're on feed, what type of growth promotants you use. Are we keeping the caloric intake enough to offset the influence of the growth promotants? How about health? When you received those cattle, was there morbidity, mortality? How did they perform? One of the greatest challenges we actually faced early on was the fact that many of you in this room and many of our producers were the best at producing to a live endpoint. But producing cattle to a meat endpoint is a whole different proposition. I know growing up I always heard the last 30 days of feeding is the most expensive, right? Well, in a meat program, that last 30 days is actually the most profitable period for you. Because why? You're adding yield. That yield is going up. You're putting on carcass weight more efficiently than live weight. And therefore, that last 30 days is so critical when you're feeding to a meat endpoint. And you're also fine-tuning the choice and the quality grade as well. So a lot we're learning in this process. Well, I think there's other programs. I believe there was over 25 different alliances out there as we were in the first years of U.S. premium beef. Many of those doing much of the same thing we were, going out and trying to work with processors to create value-added programs. And I think many of them probably experienced the same things we did. This chart shows total dollars paid out in each year since 1998. And over the lifetime, $275 million that we paid out to our producers in grid premiums over the cash market. But you know the exciting thing about that? There's probably another $200 million that we made at processing because of those improvements. You don't think for a minute that we had grid premiums without profitability going back to our processor. Absolutely not. So that's the exciting thing when you think about all the value we've created. So what are the outcomes? Well, as I said earlier, there's no question about it. We were creating value that did not exist. Value-based marketing has pushed hundreds of millions of dollars out into the producers' pockets and into the processing business. And we're producing a higher quality product more efficiently. How do I know that we're doing it more efficiently? Some would say that, well, it's costing a lot more to do this. Well, the reason I know is because everybody's lining up to get in. You know what it's costing you. If it wasn't working, you wouldn't be lined up wanting to get in. That's the best barometer for me, when everybody wants in. So it is working. We increased our product categories. Here's what we started with. I think that's where all of us started, selling a box. Today, we've got over 20 private label and branded products that we're marketing through our company, all that have been established outside of the licensed product categories of CAB and CHB. All these are private categories that we developed as a result of this alliance, so to speak, or ownership with processing through production and all the way back to our customers. These are products that did not exist. So the key elements of U.S. premium beef are value-based pricing, information transfer. Oh yeah, then there's this packer ownership piece. Well, let's take a second to talk about that. When we began the process of looking for partners in packing, time we went out and met with a lot of the processing businesses, we had close to 1 million cattle in our hip pocket. And there's no doubt if you walk into a packer with 1 million cattle in your hip pocket, you're going to get an audience. But when you start talking about ownership, Well, that audience thinned out a little bit. But we did have a few of them that understood the benefits of teaming up with producers, especially if they're willing to make the commitment of capital and of the cattle to get it done. We were fortunate that we were able to find a partner in Farmland Industries at the time that owned National Beef, Farmland National Beef, and became a partner in that. Initially a 29% minority owner, ultimately the parent company or the majority owner. When we began, there were 2 plants, actually 1.5. Liberal was a double shift plant and Dodge City was single shift when we began. So a lot of the growth that we've had over the last 15, 16 years has been organic. We added the double shift at Dodge City. Every time we created more products and value, that added to our top line, to total sales. We bought the processing business out in Brawley, California. We bought the tannery up in St. Joe, Missouri, the largest tannery in the United States, and retrofitting that currently. We have an international division headquartered in Chicago, Illinois, with offices in Seoul, Korea, Tokyo, Japan, and Beijing, China. We have the national carriers, the Elite Fleet Trucking Company, and we have our 2 case-ready plants on the East Coast in Hummelesworth, Pennsylvania, and Moultrie, Georgia. I don't know how many of you have read the book Good to Great. Several years ago, I was receiving calls. It was just odd. I call every month or so, every week, saying, you've got to read this book. This book is written by Jim Collins. It's a book about an analysis of companies that have made the transition from good to great. And this book kind of reminds me of what U.S. Premium Beef did. And so I bought it and I read it. It's a great book, and I would encourage you to read it. But what it really reminded me was what we've done in this industry. Not what U.S. Premium Beef has done, but what each of you have done in this industry and what the players have done this last 17 years. One of the illustrations that Jim Collins uses in the book is that of the flywheel effect. And we all grew up knowing pretty well how a flywheel works. But he said, imagine for a minute if you'd take like this stage, a 20-foot cast iron flywheel, 2 foot thick, probably weighs 3 tons. And you imagine several people getting their shoulder against that and starting to move the flywheel. It may take a day before you get a full revolution. But working consistently in the same direction, time after time, you eventually get 2 revolutions, and 4, and 10, and 20, and 50 revolutions. It may take weeks to get to that point, and other people join the effort, consistently going in the same direction. And at some point, Jim Collins describes breakthrough. Now, I'm not an engineer, but breakthrough being where the mass of the flywheel is now working for you, where you can apply the same energy and you're still improving. It's still speeding up. It's still revolving quicker. That's what it feels like in our industry today. What our industry has done in the last 17 years to go from the marketing system that we had, the limited product offerings to what we have today is truly miraculous. I think Don Good had it right when he stood up, as he always did. This was a critical crossroads for our industry, and our industry stepped up. So let's talk a little bit about what this means for us in the future. History is the best indicator of what we'll see in the future. I think we'll continue to see product segmentation. I think the flywheel momentum is there. I think there's an interest from the consumer. There's an efficient flow of information. I think you may see things like humane handling certification. You may see more of a segmentation of natural. You may see some segmentation of feeding programs, particularly in the export markets. But I think you will continue to see additional offerings from all processors in product segmentation. I think because of that, you're going to see more calls for regulatory restrictions on marketing. There's discussion today, and I think the discussion's healthy. Is our cash market healthy? More and more of our cattle, either through feeding program alignments or grid formula alignments, are coming off of the cash market. And number one, I would applaud the efforts. I think TCFA's done some work, and NCBA and others on this. But I would caution and be careful that we don't move back and lose momentum. I think we need to be fact-based. And I think in that vein, our folks, our friends at CattleFax had prepared a chart, and I've seen it a number of times in different presentations, just kind of reminding us as producers, what is that relationship between the fed price and the box price? Is there something going on in the marketplace that's not efficient, that's not competitive? Again, I think it's a good idea to keep watching this. I'm not going to get into today what our alternatives are, because I think I'd probably run way past my time if I did. But I think it's good to understand it and research it, but let's base those decisions on facts and be careful and cautious about jumping in and looking for regulations to limit how we're marketing our cattle. Voluntary versus mandatory ID. I know there's some efforts out there, again, in a national voluntary ID program. I think that's fine. I don't think it's going to hurt us. I think generally voluntary ID programs are driven by a consumer preference and by private companies. But I would offer this. I think that mandatory ID should be part of the discussion. Mandatory ID is insurance premium. On December 25th of 2003, if you'd have taken a vote of the producers after the single case of BSE, I think the vast majority of producers would have said we need mandatory ID, right? We've become a little complacent. And I think part of the dialogue should include discussion about going to a mandatory ID. I know it's controversial, but I think if we would, heaven forbid, have another event, we will wish we had, if we're not able to trace. Most of our competitors in the export market already have some form of mandatory ID. Increased social media usage. Deb's going to sit over here and laugh a little bit because she knows I'm not the most adept in social media. But I will tell you this, we need to do a better job of telling the story. Our detractors and our competitors do a very good job of telling the story. And I'm sure most of you are watching a Super Bowl this year. And when the blackout occurred, you can imagine the crisis for advertisers. Here you've paid all this money for commercials and advertising, and you lost your audience. You know, we're going to get the kids to bed. We got work tomorrow. What are we going to do? Well, the national advertisers, including Audi and Oreo cookies and others, went to the social media. But instantaneously, they came up with topical ads. You can still dunk in the dark. And I think that while we're making great strides in using social media to watch the chatter and the discussion to protect our interests, thinking of LFTB and some of the challenges we've had, but I think we can take that further. I think there's more that we can do in social media. And if an old farm kid could do this in about 2 minutes, somebody surely can. When you think about, beef, what could we be doing if something like that happened? Increased political activity. I've had the opportunity, maybe not necessarily the pleasure, but the opportunity to spend quite a bit of time in Washington, D.C. over the last 15 years. One thing I would take away is do not ever underestimate the value of an individual contact. Those that show up do run the country. There's no question about it. And the other thing I'd say is don't be afraid to meet with those that disagree with you. When we were debating the proposed GIPSA rule, I found myself, like I think many of us, meeting with people that agreed with us and letting them carry the water. And in my opinion, we were losing that battle. And I got to look at my itinerary thinking, I need to go meet with people that disagree with us. And so the next 3 trips to Washington, D.C., I met with 30 members of Congress and leadership that did not agree with me on GIPSA. And I met with members of the administration. Whether it was true or not, it was amazing how many times I heard, well, I've never heard that before. Or after I got through visiting with them saying, well, asking me, why are we doing this? And what I take away from that is don't underestimate the value of meeting with somebody that disagrees with you. Be polite, be informational, but believe me, when their other groups were coming in telling them the other side of the story, they're thinking about what you've told them. And I think it sure helped us in that debate. Allied industry partnerships. None of us will forget this commercial, right? So God made a farmer. I think each and every one of us ought to go home and think about a supplier or an allied industry that we work with and approach them about partnering with us to tell our story. I don't know how much good that ad did. I don't know, Deb, how you quantify those things, but that had to do us a lot of good in telling the world a story about farmers and what we do and what we think of the environment. But we need to form more of these partnerships. I know NCBA with John Deere. I know there's others, but whether it's a pharmaceutical company or whoever it is, we ought to be forming partnerships with them to tell our story better. World beef demand. Dr. Lowell Catlett spoke recently at NCBA, and he talked about the 7 billion people that populate the world, 1 billion people that have all the money they need to buy natural, free range or whatever, another billion that are getting there, another billion that have gone from abject poverty to enough money to buy beef when they want to. 300 million Chinese have now moved into the middle class. That's the population of the U.S. The point is, I think there's tremendous opportunities for us into the future. I think the challenges for us are remaining competitive. And we're the best in the world at being efficient. We tend to be on a world market with our inputs, but it's the regulatory side that is going to be a challenge for us. We need to encourage people to continue free trade activity and avoid at all cost protectionist policy. Well, I've probably gone past my time, but I guess what I'd like to end by talking about is you might recognize some of the people on these pages. These are the champions of what's been done the last 17 years. These are people that were asking for accountability. They said, we want to be responsible for what we're producing, but we want to be paid for it. And we want information, the tools to affect change. And all these people, some from Mississippi, many of them from Kansas and Texas, and others are telling their story of how they went out and utilized U.S. prime beef and other programs to change the way they're producing products. Well, I really might be remiss if I didn't circle back around to Henry Gardner. One of our favorite activities at U.S. Prime Beef, in the vein of connecting consumers with our producers, was hosting our customers on the ranches and feedlots of our members. And you can imagine where our favorite stop was, Gardner Angus Ranch. And you can all picture Henry, the gracious host, the industry statesman, the ambassador. And Henry would welcome these individuals and be a gracious host. And in every one of these meetings, whether it was at the dinner table, the AI barn, or out on the ranch, at some point in time, Henry would stop and look these Japanese in the eye and say, if you have anything to say or have any input on our product, I'd like to know because I can change it. Henry would take accountability. And let me tell you, the look on their faces and the meaning of that was significant. To have a producer looking them in the eye and say, you tell me what you want differently. I can take it. And be critical if you want, because we can affect change. Well, I'm going to leave you with a few pictures of Henry. Henry doing what Henry does best. You know, one thing I like about this picture, by the way, is see what Henry's doing? He's listening. Communication is 9 parts listening and 1 part talking. These pictures of what Henry does best, listening, learning, and teaching. A lifelong journey to improve our product and secure our future for generations to come. Henry, we thank you, and Mark and Greg, thank you for this honor and this opportunity. Thank you.